The snow fell in silence over Millbrook, Illinois that February morning in 2005, blanketing the modest suburban streets in a layer of white that made everything look peaceful, almost sacred. It was the kind of town where people still waved to their neighbors, where the local diner knew your order before you sat down, where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. But on February 14th, Valentine's Day, something did happen. Something that would haunt this community for nearly 2 decades. Something that would eventually reveal truths far darker than anyone could have imagined. The Parker family lived on Sycamore Drive, a quiet residential street lined with oak trees that had stood for generations. Thomas Parker, 42 years old, worked as an accountant at a firm in downtown Chicago, commuting an hour each way to provide for his family. His wife, Jennifer, 38, taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary School, beloved by students and parents alike. Their daughter, 16-year-old Melissa, was a junior at Millbrook High, a straight-A student with dreams of studying marine biology at UC San Diego. Their son, 12-year-old David, played Little League baseball and collected comic books with the dedication of an archivist. They were, by all accounts, the picture of American suburban life. Normal, safe, until they were not. The first indication that something was wrong came from Jennifer's sister, Amanda Reeves, who lived 40 minutes away in Naperville. Jennifer and Amanda spoke every Sunday without fail, a ritual they had maintained since their mother passed away from cancer 3 years earlier. When Sunday, February 13th came and went without a call, Amanda felt a flutter of concern but dismissed it. Perhaps Jennifer had gotten busy with Valentine's Day preparations. But when Monday morning arrived and Jennifer did not show up for work at the elementary school and her phone continued to ring unanswered, Amanda's concern transformed into genuine worry. She called the Millbrook Police Department at 10:47 a.m. on February 14, 2005. And the dispatcher, a woman named Lorraine Sutton who had worked the desk for 15 years, took down the information with professional efficiency but without particular alarm. Adults went missing all the time, usually by choice, usually returning within 48 hours with explanations ranging from embarrassing to mundane. Protocol required a welfare check, nothing more. Officer Kevin Hayes, 28 years old and relatively new to the Millbrook force, drew the assignment. He arrived at the Parker residence at 11:23 a.m., noting in his report that the driveway held 2 vehicles, a 2003 Honda Accord and a 2001 Ford Explorer. Both were covered in snow, suggesting they had not moved since the previous night's snowfall, which had begun around 8 p.m. The walkway to the front door remained unshoveled, unusual for a neighborhood where most residents cleared their paths first thing in the morning. Hayes knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, calling out his identification. Still nothing. He walked the perimeter of the house, peering through windows into darkened rooms that revealed nothing obviously amiss. The back door was locked. Everything appeared normal from the outside, which made the silence inside feel somehow worse. Following protocol, Hayes contacted his supervisor, Sergeant Dale Montgomery, who authorized forced entry for the welfare check. At 11:51 a.m., Hayes broke the lock on the front door and stepped inside. The house was cold. The thermostat in the hallway read 58 degrees, suggesting the heat had been off or turned down for some time. Hayes called out again, identifying himself, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. He moved through the first floor methodically, living room, kitchen, dining room, bathroom. Nothing appeared disturbed. Dishes sat in the drying rack beside the sink. Nail rested unopened on the kitchen counter, postmarked February 11th. A calendar on the refrigerator showed Melissa's volleyball practice, scheduled for February 14th at 4 p.m., circled in red marker. Hayes climbed the stairs to the second floor, his hand resting on his service weapon, though he could not have articulated why. The master bedroom door stood open. The bed was made, the room tidy. David's room at the end of the hall showed the typical chaos of a 12-year-old boy, clothes on the floor, posters of baseball players on the walls, homework scattered across a desk. Melissa's room was neater, decorated with posters of ocean scenes and photographs of friends. It was in the bathroom that Hayes found the first real sign that something was wrong. Toothbrushes stood in the holder beside the sink. Contact lens, solution, and cases sat on the counter. Jennifer's purse hung on a hook behind the door, her wallet inside containing her driver's license, credit cards, and $83 in cash. In the master bedroom closet, Hayes found suitcases stacked neatly on the top shelf. Whatever had happened to the Parker family, they had not planned to leave. But they were gone. All four of them vanished without a trace. The Millbrook Police Department launched a missing persons investigation immediately, upgrading it within hours to a suspected crime scene. Detectives Rebecca Thornton and James Castellano took the lead, both veterans with more than 15 years of experience each. They had worked missing person cases before, runaways and custody disputes and the occasional tragic accident. But something about the Parker case felt different from the start, Thornton would later recall in an interview with the Illinois State Police. And the completeness of the disappearance, the lack of any logical explanation, the way the house seemed frozen in time as if the family had simply evaporated mid-routine. The investigation expanded rapidly. Crime scene technicians processed the house from top to bottom, looking for signs of forced entry, struggle, or violence. They found nothing. No broken windows, no disturbed locks, no blood, no evidence of a confrontation. On the family's computers, all three of them were seized and forensically analyzed. Email accounts revealed nothing suspicious, Jennifer corresponding with other teachers about lesson plans, Thomas exchanging messages with colleagues about tax season deadlines, and Melissa chatting with friends about an upcoming dance at school. David barely used his computer except to play online games. Phone records showed the last outgoing call from the Parker landline occurred at 6:47 p.m. on February 12th, when Jennifer called her sister Amanda to confirm their Sunday call, which they would never have. Thomas's cell phone last pinged a tower near his office in Chicago at 5:34 p.m. on February 12th, consistent with his commute home. Jennifer's cell phone, found charging on her nightstand, showed no activity after 4:12 p.m. on February 12th. The children did not have cell phones, a decision Jennifer and Thomas had made despite Melissa's increasingly vocal protests. The detectives interviewed neighbors up and down Sycamore Drive. Margaret Chen, 73, who lived directly across the street, reported seeing the family arrive home together around 6:15 p.m. on February 12th, pulling into the driveway as she was closing her curtains against the evening cold. She thought nothing of it, just a normal Saturday night for a normal family. She did not see them again. Robert and Patricia Drummond, who lived 2 houses down, had been out of town visiting their daughter in Wisconsin from February 10th through February 14th, and saw nothing. The Kowalskis, next door on the left, kept to themselves and noticed nothing unusual, though they admitted they rarely paid attention to their neighbors' comings and goings. The Hendersons, next door on the right, had been home all weekend but had not seen or heard anything out of the ordinary from the Parker house. No screams, no arguments, no sounds of vehicles arriving or departing at unusual hours. It was as if the Parker family had been erased from existence sometime between 6:15 p.m. on Saturday, February 12th, and 10:47 a.m. on Monday, February 14th, when Amanda Reeves made her fateful call to the police. The media descended on Millbrook within days. Missing family cases always drew attention, but 4 people vanishing simultaneously from a locked house with no signs of struggle captured the public imagination in a particular way. It suggested something sinister, something calculated, something that could happen to anyone. But the local Chicago news stations ran the story nightly. CNN picked it up. Nancy Grace devoted an entire episode to the case, speculating wildly about everything from domestic violence to human trafficking to cult activity. Amanda Reeves became the family spokesperson, her face gaunt with worry as she stood before microphones and cameras, begging for anyone with information to come forward. Thomas's parents, retired and living in Florida, flew to Illinois immediately, setting up a command center in their hotel room, coordinating search efforts with local volunteers. Jennifer's father had died years earlier, but her mother, Margaret, traveled from Arizona, moving through the investigation in a state of shock that never quite lifted. Search teams combed the woods surrounding Millbrook, looking for any sign of the missing family. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the February cold, eyes scanning the ground for clothing, personal effects, or worse. Divers searched nearby lakes and ponds once the ice began to thaw in March. The dogs tracked scents from the Parker house, but lost them at the end of the driveway, suggesting the family had left in a vehicle, but whose vehicle remained a mystery. Both family cars sat untouched in the garage. Detectives Thornton and Castellano pursued every possible lead with relentless determination. They investigated Thomas's finances, looking for evidence of gambling debts, embezzlement, or other financial pressures that might have motivated him to disappear his family. And they found nothing. His accounting work was meticulous and honest, his finances stable if not particularly impressive. The family carried a mortgage and car payments like millions of other American families, but they were not drowning in debt and had nearly $18,000 in savings. They investigated Jennifer's life with equal thoroughness. Could there have been an affair, a secret relationship, a reason to flee? Her colleagues at the elementary school described her as devoted to her students, professional, kind. Her friends painted the same picture: a good mother, a loving wife, a woman who seemed genuinely content with her life. There were no secret boyfriends, no hidden bank accounts, no digital footprints leading toward an alternate identity. Melissa and David were similarly dead ends in terms of motive. Melissa's friends described her as popular but not wild, responsible, focused on her future. She had a boyfriend, a fellow junior named Tyler Brennan, but they had been dating for only 3 months, and the relationship appeared innocent, appropriate for teenagers their age. Tyler was interviewed extensively, and his alibi for February 12th checked out completely. That he had been at his grandmother's birthday party in Joliet from 4 p.m. through 11 p.m., with dozens of witnesses and photographs confirming his presence. David was 12, still in that space between childhood and adolescence, more interested in baseball cards than anything sinister. His teachers described him as a sweet kid, maybe a little shy, but well-adjusted and happy, which left detectives with a terrifying conclusion. If the family had not left voluntarily, then someone had taken them. But how? And why? And where were they now? The FBI became involved in March 2005, when it became clear that the Millbrook Police Department, despite their best efforts, lacked the resources and expertise to solve a case of this magnitude. Special Agent Laura Finch took the lead for the Bureau, bringing with her a team of specialists in violent crime, forensic analysis, and behavioral profiling. They re-examined every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every possible theory. Agent Finch focused particular attention on what she called the logistics problem. Moving 4 people, potentially against their will, without leaving evidence required planning, skill, and most likely help. One person could not easily subdue and transport an entire family, especially one that included a grown man and a teenage girl who would have fought back. There should have been signs of struggle, noise that neighbors would have heard, physical evidence left behind. The absence of these elements suggested either incredible luck or professional execution. The FBI developed several working theories. The first, Thomas Parker had been involved in something criminal, something serious enough that organized crime figures had targeted his family. This theory collapsed under investigation when no evidence of criminal involvement could be found. Thomas's life was an open book, boring in its normalcy. The second theory, a stranger abduction, a predator who had stalked the family and struck when opportunity presented itself. But what kind of predator takes an entire family? Serial killers typically targeted individuals, usually women. Family annihilators were usually family members themselves, and the lack of bodies made this theory problematic. Where would someone keep 4 people? How would they control them? The third theory, the one that kept Agent Finch awake at night, someone close to the family was responsible, someone who knew their routines, had access to the house, and had the trust necessary to get close without raising alarms. But every person in the Parker family's orbit had been investigated, alibis checked and rechecked, lives examined in minute detail. No one emerged as a viable suspect. Months turned into years. The media attention faded. The volunteer searches ended. The command center closed. Amanda Reeves returned to her life in Naperville, forever changed, forever waiting for a phone call that never came. Thomas's parents went back to Florida, their retirement years shadowed by the loss of their son and grandchildren. Margaret, Jennifer's mother, returned to Arizona, where she would die 4 years later, never knowing what happened to her daughter. The Parker house sat empty for more than a year before the bank foreclosed on the mortgage. Amanda, as Jennifer's next of kin, arranged for the family's belongings to be put into storage, unable to bring herself to sort through the clothes and photographs and memories. The house was eventually sold to a young couple from Chicago who got it at a significant discount, aware of its history but willing to overlook tragedy for a good deal. They would live there for 7 years before the whispers and the curiosity of neighbors drove them to sell and move away. In Millbrook, the Parker case became legend, the kind of story people told on dark nights, the kind of mystery that spawned amateur investigators and conspiracy theorists. Some believed the family had been killed and buried somewhere in the vast Illinois countryside, waiting to be discovered by some future construction project or farming accident. Others thought they had been taken across state lines, perhaps even across national borders, sold into some unimaginable fate. A few optimists clung to the hope that the Parkers had entered witness protection, that Thomas had testified against someone dangerous and the whole disappearance was an elaborate government operation. The FBI never confirmed or denied this theory, but people close to the investigation knew it was nonsense. Detectives Thornton and Castellano never stopped thinking about the case. It haunted them, the way certain cases haunt good investigators. They followed every new lead, every anonymous tip, every reported sighting of the Parker family members that came in over the years. A woman who looked like Jennifer spotted in a Seattle grocery store in 2007. A teenager who resembled Melissa seen at a Phoenix mall in 2009. A man matching Thomas's description photographed in the background of a tourist photo taken in Montreal in 2011. All dead ends, cases of mistaken identity, the desperate pattern recognition of a public that wanted the story to have an ending, any ending, other than the terrible uncertainty that reality offered. The case officially went cold in 2010, 5 years after the disappearance. The file remained open, as all unsolved cases do, but active investigations ceased. There was simply nowhere left to look, no stone left unturned. Thornton retired in 2013, the Parker case her one major failure, the ghost that would follow her into retirement. Castellano continued working until 2016, when a heart attack forced his own retirement. He would die in 2019, taking with him whatever theories or suspicions he had developed over the years of investigation. Agent Finch moved on to other cases, other missing persons, other families destroyed by violence and tragedy. But she kept the Parker file in her office, pulling it out occasionally to review, hoping that fresh eyes or new forensic techniques might reveal something previously missed. DNA analysis improved dramatically between 2005 and 2020, but there was no DNA to analyze. Digital forensics evolved, but the Parker family's digital footprint had been thoroughly examined and revealed nothing. Sometimes, Finch knew, cases remained unsolved not because investigators failed, but because the perpetrators succeeded completely. By 2024, 19 years after the disappearance, as the Parker case had faded from public consciousness, except among true crime enthusiasts who discovered it through internet forums and the podcast episodes devoted to unsolved mysteries. Melissa would have been 35 years old, possibly with children of her own. David would have been 31, presumably finished with college, established in a career. Thomas and Jennifer would have been in their early 60s, perhaps thinking about retirement, certainly thinking about grandchildren. But none of them had been seen or heard from in nearly 2 decades. And then, in August 2024, everything changed. Detective Iris Volkov, 34 years old, had joined the Millbrook Police Department in 2015, a full decade after the Parker disappearance. She knew the case, of course. Every officer in Millbrook knew the case. It was departmental law, the big one that got away, the mystery that defined the department's history. But Volkov had not been involved in the original investigation and brought no emotional baggage to her examination of the file. She had pulled the Parker case as part of a department initiative to review all cold cases using modern investigative techniques. In July 2024, she began reading through the original reports, the witness statements, the forensic analysis, and all of it now digitized and searchable in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 2005. Volkov read with the detachment of someone viewing history, someone not personally invested in the outcome. What caught her attention was something so small that the original investigators had noted it but not pursued it with any vigor, and a charge on Thomas Parker's credit card from February 11, 2005, the day before the family vanished. $87 at a hardware store in Aurora, Illinois, about 30 minutes from Millbrook. The original investigators had checked it, confirming that Thomas had purchased various items including rope, duct tape, and plastic sheeting. The store's security footage from that date had been reviewed at the time, showing Thomas making the purchase alone, nothing unusual about his demeanor or behavior. The investigators in 2005 had noted the purchase as potentially suspicious but ultimately found no way to connect it to the disappearance. People bought rope and tape and plastic sheeting for countless innocent reasons: home repairs, storage projects, weatherproofing. Thomas and Jennifer had been planning to reorganize their garage that spring, a project mentioned to several friends and family members. The purchase made sense in that context. But Volkov wondered about something the original investigators had not pursued in depth. Why had Thomas driven to Aurora to make this purchase? There were 2 hardware stores closer to Millbrook, including one just 10 minutes from the Parker house. Why drive 30 minutes out of his way? She pulled the security footage from the Aurora hardware store, preserved in the case file, and watched it again, seeing what the original investigators had seen: Thomas Parker, looking perfectly normal, selecting items from shelves, paying at the register, leaving. Nothing unusual. But Volkov watched it again, and then again, and on the 4th viewing she noticed something else. In the background of the footage, barely visible, another customer stood in the checkout line behind Thomas. The person's face was partially obscured by a baseball cap, and the quality of the 2005 security footage made identification difficult. But Volkov could make out enough features to note the person down as a potential person of interest. She ran the partial face through the FBI's facial recognition database, a tool that had not existed in 2005. The system returned no matches to known criminals, which was not surprising given the poor image quality. But Volkov was not done. She expanded her search, looking through every piece of evidence in the Parker case for any other appearance of someone matching this person's general description: the approximate height, build, the style of clothing visible in the footage. She found it in a photograph taken at Melissa Parker's volleyball game on February 7, 2005, 5 days before the disappearance. The photo had been provided to investigators by another parent who had been documenting the season for a team scrapbook. It showed the bleachers filled with parents and students, the gym decorated with school banners, Melissa mid-serve on the court. And in the crowd, sitting 3 rows back on the far right side, was a figure wearing a baseball cap, face partially obscured, but matching the approximate build and clothing style of the person from the hardware store footage. Volkov felt the cold tingle of a lead, a real lead, the first one the case had seen in nearly 2 decades. She kept digging. The figure in the baseball cap became Volkov's obsession through late August and into September 2024. She spent hours comparing the grainy security footage from the Aurora hardware store with the photograph from Melissa's volleyball game, measuring proportions, analyzing posture, looking for any identifying details that might have been missed in the original investigation 19 years earlier. The technology available to her now far exceeded what Thornton and Castellano had access to in 2005, but the poor quality of the source material placed hard limits on what even modern software could extract. She requested assistance from the FBI's forensic imaging unit, sending them both pieces of evidence with a request for enhancement and analysis. While she waited for their response, Volkov continued working backward through the Parker case file, looking for any other instances where this mysterious figure might have appeared, any other intersection between this person and the Parker family that the original investigation might have overlooked. What she found next changed everything. Buried in the supplemental reports from the original investigation, Volkov discovered witness statements from employees at Millbrook Elementary School where Jennifer Parker had taught third grade. Multiple teachers and staff members had been interviewed in February and March of 2005, all providing variations of the same information. Jennifer was a wonderful teacher, beloved by her students, professional and kind with colleagues, showed no signs of distress or unusual behavior in the days before her disappearance. But one statement, taken on March 3, 2005, by Detective Castellano, included a detail that had apparently seemed irrelevant at the time. A teacher's aide named Gloria Hutchins mentioned that in late January 2005, about 2 weeks before the disappearance, she had noticed a man sitting in a car across the street from the school on 3 separate occasions during afternoon dismissal. She had not thought much of it initially, assuming he was a parent waiting to pick up a child, but something about his behavior struck her as odd. He never got out of the car, never waved to any children, just sat and watched as kids poured out of the building at the end of the school day. Hutchins had mentioned it to the school principal, but before any action could be taken, the man stopped appearing. When Jennifer Parker disappeared 2 weeks later, Hutchins remembered the man in the car and reported it to police, thinking it might be connected. Castellano had noted the information and apparently followed up by checking with the school principal, who confirmed Hutchins's account but could provide no additional details. The man had never approached anyone, never violated any laws, and without a license plate number or physical description beyond average height, dark clothing, baseball cap, there was nothing to investigate. Mum, Volkov read this statement 3 times, her pulse quickening with each pass. A man in a baseball cap watching the school where Jennifer Parker taught, appearing multiple times in the weeks before the family vanished, then disappearing. Could this be the same person from the hardware store and the volleyball game? She called Gloria Hutchins, now retired and living in a seniors community in Schaumburg. The woman was 76 years old now, her memories of 2005 faded but not entirely gone. Yes, she remembered the man in the car. Yes, she had reported it to police. No, she could not provide any better description now than she had given 19 years ago. Average build, dark jacket, baseball cap pulled low. She had never seen his face clearly. The car had been dark-colored, maybe black or dark blue, but she could not remember the make or model. Volkov thanked her and hung up, frustrated but not defeated. She was building a pattern now, connecting dots that the original investigators had noted but not linked together. Someone had been watching the Parker family in the weeks before they disappeared. Someone had been at Melissa's volleyball game. Someone had been at the hardware store where Thomas bought supplies. Someone had been watching Jennifer's school. The question was, who? In October 2024, the FBI's Forensic Imaging Unit returned their analysis. Using advanced enhancement algorithms and comparative analysis software, they had extracted additional details from both the hardware store footage and the volleyball game photograph. While they still could not make a positive identification, they were able to determine with high confidence that the person in both images was the same individual, male, approximately 5 feet 9 inches to 6 feet tall, medium build, age difficult to determine, but likely between 30 and 50 years old at the time the images were captured. More significantly, the FBI analysts had noticed something in the hardware store footage that Volkov had missed. When Thomas Parker exited the store carrying his purchases, the man in the baseball cap had followed him out seconds later, but visible briefly in the footage from the exterior camera before walking out of frame. The analysts could not determine if this was coincidental or deliberate, but the timing suggested the man might have been following Thomas. Armed with this new information, Volkov expanded her investigation beyond the immediate Parker family circle. The original investigation had focused primarily on people the Parkers knew, family members, friends, colleagues, neighbors. But what if the perpetrator had been a stranger, someone who had selected the Parker family for reasons unknown and stalked them before striking? She began researching similar cases across Illinois and neighboring states, looking for patterns, families that had disappeared without a trace, cases involving surveillance before abduction, crimes that showed similar levels of planning and execution. The FBI maintained databases of such cases, and with Agent Finch's assistance, Volkov was granted access to the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VCAP, which tracked violent crimes across jurisdictions. What emerged from this research was chilling. Between 2003 and 2007, 4 other families in the Midwest had experienced similar disappearances, the complete families vanishing from their homes with no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, and no bodies ever recovered. The cases had never been officially linked because they occurred in different states, handled by different agencies, and the lack of physical evidence made it impossible to definitively connect them. But the similarities were striking. In June 2003, the Sullivan family vanished from their home in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Patrick Sullivan, his wife Karen, and their 2 children, ages 10 and 14. Gone without a trace, their house left undisturbed, their vehicles still in the garage. In November 2006, the Martinez family disappeared from Fort Wayne, Indiana. Louise and Rosa Martinez and their 3 children, ages 8, 12, and 16. No signs of struggle, no evidence, no bodies ever found. In March 2007, the Yates family vanished from their home in Springfield, Missouri. Gordon and Heather Yates with their twin daughters, age 13. The house was locked from the inside when police arrived for a welfare check. No indication of where the family had gone or what had happened to them. And sandwiched chronologically between these cases, the Parker family in February 2005. Volkov presented her findings to the Millbrook police chief, Daniel Warren, in late October 2024. Warren, who had been a patrol officer during the original Parker investigation and remembered the case vividly, immediately grasped the implications. If these cases were connected, if a single perpetrator or group of perpetrators had been responsible for multiple family abductions spanning several years and multiple states, then they were dealing with something unprecedented in American criminal history. A serial family killer operating for years without detection, disposing of bodies so effectively that not a single victim had ever been found. Chief Warren contacted the FBI, and by early November 2024, a multi-agency task force had been assembled. Agent Finch came out of semi-retirement to consult on the case, bringing with her all the knowledge and institutional memory from the original Parker investigation. Representatives from law enforcement agencies in Iowa, Indiana, and Missouri joined the task force, each bringing their own cold cases and their own desperation for answers. And the task force worked through November and December, comparing evidence, looking for connections. They found them in the details. Each disappearance had occurred on a weekend, giving the perpetrator maximum time before the family would be reported missing. Each family had been middle class, living in suburban neighborhoods, neither wealthy enough to be under security protection nor poor enough to lack resources. Each family had included children, always at least 2, always school-aged. Each disappearance had been clean, professional, leaving investigators with nothing to work with. But they also found differences that troubled them. The families were spread across 4 states, hundreds of miles apart. But they were different ethnicities, different professions, different social circles. There was no obvious connection between the victims, no shared employer or vacation destination or online presence that might have brought them to a perpetrator's attention. If one person was responsible for all 5 disappearances, the selection criteria remained mysterious. Then, in January 2025, 20 years almost to the day after the Parker family vanished, Detective Volkov found the connection she had been seeking. She had been reviewing financial records, looking for any transactions that might link the families. Credit card statements, bank transfers, checks written in the months before each disappearance. It was tedious work, scanning through thousands of mundane purchases, looking for anything unusual or shared across multiple victims. Most investigators would have given up, convinced that whoever had taken these families had been too careful to leave such an obvious trail. But Volkov persisted, and on January 11, 2025, she found it. In September 2004, 5 months before the Parker family disappeared, Thomas Parker had written a check for $375 to a company called Midwest Property Solutions. The memo line on the check read, "Basement waterproofing consultation." Volkov barely breathed as she cross-referenced this against the financial records from the other families. In March 2003, 3 months before their disappearance, Patrick Sullivan had paid $350 to Midwest Property Solutions for foundation inspection. In August 2006, 3 months before the Martinez family vanished, Luis Martinez had written a check for $400 to the same company for basement moisture assessment. Gordon Yates had paid them $295 in December 2006, 3 months before his family disappeared. The Sullivan case predated the founding of the company that had been identified in the other records, but Volkov pressed forward and requesting business records from the Iowa Secretary of State. What she discovered made her stomach drop. Midwest Property Solutions had been registered as an LLC in Illinois in January 2004. Before that, a similar company called Heartland Foundation Services had operated in Iowa from 2001 through 2003. Patrick Sullivan had paid Heartland Foundation Services $600 for foundation repair estimates in April 2003. The companies were owned by the same person, a man named Vincent Paul Greer. Volkov ran the name through every database available to law enforcement. Vincent Greer, 54 years old, had no criminal record, no history of violence, no red flags in his background. He had been born in Gary, Indiana in 1970, had served 4 years in the Army in the early 90s without incident, and had worked various construction and home repair jobs throughout the Midwest for the past 2 decades. He had never been arrested, never been sued, never appeared on law enforcement's radar in any capacity. But he had visited the homes of 4 families shortly before they vanished, gaining access under the pretext of providing estimates for foundation and basement repairs. And if the pattern held, he had likely visited the Parker home as well, though no financial records confirmed it. Perhaps Thomas had paid cash, or perhaps the transaction had been lost in the chaos of the investigation and estate settlement. The task force moved quickly. They obtained warrants for Greer's financial records, phone records, vehicle registrations, and property holdings. What they found painted a picture of a man who moved frequently, never staying in one place for more than a year or two, always driving older vehicles registered to various LLCs he controlled, always working jobs that brought him into people's homes where he could observe family dynamics, routines, and vulnerabilities. Well, in February 2025, 20 years after the Parker family disappeared, investigators located Vincent Greer living in a rented house outside Peoria, Illinois, operating under yet another business name, Prairie Home Inspections. Surveillance teams watched him for 2 weeks, documenting his movements, building a case. They observed him conducting legitimate home inspections, meeting with clients, living what appeared to be a normal, unremarkable life. But they also observed something else. On February 19, 2025, Greer drove to a rural property in Bureau County, Illinois, 60 miles northwest of Peoria. The property, which records showed he had purchased in 2008 for cash through one of his LLCs, that consisted of 47 acres of farmland with a small farmhouse and a large barn. He arrived at 9 a.m. and did not leave until after dark, his vehicle the only one on the property all day. Investigators obtained additional warrants, this time for the Bureau County property. On February 23, 2025, the task force executed simultaneous raids on Greer's residence in Peoria and his rural property in Bureau County. Greer was arrested without incident at his home, expressing surprise but not resistance. He said nothing except to request an attorney, which was his right. What investigators found at the rural property would shock law enforcement veterans who thought they had seen everything. The barn had been extensively modified, its interior divided into multiple rooms with reinforced doors and soundproofing. Investigators found restraints, chains, locks, all installed with the kind of professional competence one would expect from someone with construction experience. They found personal items, clothing, jewelry, family photographs, Among these items were things that belonged to the Parker family. Melissa's volleyball jersey, number 17. David's baseball glove with his name written in marker on the leather. Jennifer's watch, a silver piece she had worn every day, recognizable from photographs. Thomas's wallet, his driver's license still inside. They found similar items from the other families. Karen Sullivan's wedding ring. One of the Martinez children's backpacks. Heather Yates's prescription glasses. Trophies, souvenirs, evidence that Vincent Greer had indeed been responsible for all 5 family disappearances spanning 4 years and 4 states. But they did not find the families. They did not find bodies. They did not find any indication of what Greer had done with his victims or where they might be. The investigation of the property continued for weeks. Ground-penetrating radar scanned every inch of the 47 acres, looking for burial sites. Cadaver dogs were brought in, sweeping the barn, the house, the surrounding fields. Forensic teams processed every surface, every object, every possible piece of evidence. They found trace amounts of blood in the barn, multiple DNA profiles that would eventually be matched to members of all 5 families. They found more personal effects, more souvenirs, more proof that Greer had held these people captive in this location. But still, no bodies, no remains, no indication of how he had disposed of the victims or when they had died. The property had no unusually disturbed ground, no burn pits, no wells or septic systems where bodies might have been hidden. It was as if the families had vanished from this place just as completely as they had vanished from their homes. Vincent Greer remained silent, refusing to answer any questions beyond confirming his identity. His attorney, a public defender named Michael Torres, who had drawn the assignment of his career, could offer no explanation for the evidence found at his client's property. Greer maintained his right to silence, and without a confession, without bodies, prosecutors faced the challenge of building a case on circumstantial evidence alone. In March 2025, Vincent Paul Greer was formally charged with 20 counts of first-degree murder, 4 members of the Parker family, 4 members of the Sullivan family, 5 members of the Martinez family, 4 members of the Yates family, and 3 members of a 5th family whose disappearance investigators had connected to Greer through additional financial records. The cases were consolidated into a single prosecution in federal court, given that the crimes crossed state lines and involved kidnapping, which is a federal offense. The trial was scheduled for September 2025. Prosecutors expressed confidence that the physical evidence, the financial connections, and the personal effects found at Greer's property would be sufficient for conviction even without bodies and without a confession. Defense attorneys argued that without definitive proof of death, without remains, without any witness testimony about what happened to the families, the prosecution could not prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The families of the victims waited, hoping for answers that might never come. Amanda Reeves, now 57 years old, traveled to Illinois for the preliminary hearings, finally seeing the face of the man who she believed had destroyed her family. She told reporters that she felt no satisfaction in the arrest, no sense of closure, because her sister and niece and nephew and brother-in-law were still gone, but their fates still unknown. In April 2025, as prosecutors continued building their case, a forensic accountant working for the task force discovered something that had been hidden in the complex web of LLCs and business accounts that Greer had maintained. Between 2003 and 2008, Greer had made regular payments totaling nearly $800,000 to a waste management company in Wisconsin, at a company that specialized in industrial disposal and cremation services. The amounts were far beyond what a small home inspection business would need for normal operations. The investigators descended on the Wisconsin facility, which had closed in 2011. They interviewed former employees, obtained old business records, and eventually located the former owner, a man named Russell Erickson, who was now 71 years old and living in retirement in Minnesota. Erickson claimed he had no knowledge of anything illegal, that Greer had simply been a regular customer who paid in cash for disposal services, and that he had never asked questions about what was being disposed of because it was not his business to ask. When pressed by investigators, Erickson admitted that Greer had always brought his materials late at night, always personally supervised the disposal process, and always insisted on immediate cremation with no documentation beyond basic receipts. At the time, Erickson had assumed Greer was disposing of construction waste, contaminated materials, perhaps things from hoarding situations or estate cleanouts. He claimed he never suspected anything criminal, though investigators doubted this sincerity given the suspicious circumstances and the large cash payments involved. The industrial crematorium at the facility had been capable of reaching temperatures high enough to reduce organic material to ash and bone fragments in a matter of hours. If Greer had used this facility to dispose of his victims, it would explain the complete absence of remains at his property and the impossibility of recovering bodies. Bone fragments from the facility's ash pits were collected and sent for analysis, but 20 years of subsequent cremations and the degraded condition of the material made identification impossible. In May 2025, prosecutors added additional charges against Russell Erickson for his role in the disposal of evidence, though he maintained he had not known what Greer was cremating and therefore could not be held criminally responsible for facilitating murder. The question of Erickson's guilt or innocence became a secondary concern for investigators still focused on Greer himself. Vincent Greer continued to say nothing, sitting in his cell at the Federal Detention Center, reading books and waiting for trial. Psychiatric evaluators found him competent to stand trial, intelligent, and organized in his thinking. He showed no signs of mental illness, no delusions or psychosis. He simply refused to discuss the charges against him, the evidence found at his property, or what had happened to the families he was accused of killing. The trial began on September 8, 2025, in federal court in Chicago. The prosecution presented their case methodically, the financial connections proving Greer had visited each family's home shortly before they disappeared, the personal effects found at his property definitively linking him to all 5 families. The DNA evidence proving the victims had been held in his barn, the payments to the crematorium suggesting a disposal method, and the pattern of behavior showing systematic predation spanning years. The defense argued that while Greer had clearly committed crimes, including kidnapping and possibly manslaughter, the prosecution had not proven murder. Without bodies, without witnesses to the actual deaths, without any direct evidence of how or when the victims had died, the defense maintained that reasonable doubt existed. Perhaps the families had died accidentally while in Greer's custody. Perhaps they had died of natural causes. Perhaps, the defense suggested in a particularly desperate argument, some of them were still alive somewhere. The jury deliberated for 6 days. On October 3, 2025, exactly 20 years and 7 months after the Parker family vanished from their home on Sycamore Drive, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all 20 counts of first-degree murder, plus additional convictions for kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and abuse of a corpse. Vincent Paul Greer showed no reaction as the verdicts were read. He sat motionless, his face expressionless, as the judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for November. His attorneys immediately filed notice of appeal, but legal experts agreed that the evidence had been overwhelming and appeals were unlikely to succeed. Outside the courthouse, Amanda Reeves spoke to the assembled media, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. She said she was grateful for the verdict, grateful for Detective Volkov's determination, grateful for all the investigators who had never given up. But she also said that the verdict could not bring back her sister, could not undo 20 years of not knowing, and could not restore the family dinners and birthday parties and graduations and weddings that should have been. The other families issued similar statements, expressing relief that Greer would spend the rest of his life in prison, but acknowledging that true closure remained impossible without knowing exactly what had happened to their loved ones in those final hours, without being able to properly bury their dead. In November 2025, Vincent Greer was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole on each count, the sentences to run consecutively, at a symbolic gesture given that he would never live long enough to serve even a fraction of the cumulative sentence. The judge, a woman named Catherine Morrison who had presided over the trial with patience and gravity, addressed Greer directly before imposing sentence, asking if he had anything to say to the families of his victims. Greer stood, looked at the families gathered in the courtroom, and spoke his first public words since his arrest. He said simply, "I have nothing to say." Then he sat down. He was transferred to a maximum security federal penitentiary in Colorado, where he remains as of this writing. He has never provided any additional information about the murders, never explained his motives, never revealed the full details of what happened to the 20 people he killed. He receives no visitors, corresponds with no one, and spends his days in isolation, reading and maintaining his silence. Detective Iris Volkov was promoted to sergeant and received commendations from the FBI, the Illinois State Police, and multiple law enforcement agencies across the Midwest for her work on the case. She continues to work cold cases for the Millbrook Police Department, applying the same methodical determination that broke the Parker case to other unsolved mysteries. The house on Sycamore Drive has changed hands 3 more times since 2025. The current owners, a family with young children, are aware of its history but have chosen to view it as just a house, wood and brick and glass, and not responsible for the evil that once touched the people who lived there. The neighborhood has changed too, new families moving in, old families moving away, and the collective memory of that February day in 2005 slowly fading except for those who were there, those who remember. Amanda Reeves visits Jennifer's grave every year on her birthday, a symbolic gesture given that no body was ever recovered and the grave contains only photographs and mementos. She has never married, never had children of her own. She tells people that February 14, 2005, took more from her than just her sister's family. It took her belief that the world was fundamentally safe, that bad things only happened to people who somehow invited them, that justice was swift and certain. She knows better now. And the case file on the Parker family disappearance remains open, as do the files on all of Vincent Greer's victims. It's technically unsolved in the sense that not every question has been answered, not every detail known. But solved in the way that matters most, the person responsible is behind bars, prevented from ever hurting another family, these from ever making another person disappear into the terrible silence that he created and controlled for so many years. Sometimes, late at night, Detective Volkov thinks about all the things that had to align for the case to be solved. If she had not pulled that particular file for review, if she had not noticed the hardware store purchase, if facial recognition software had not advanced far enough to suggest the same person appeared in multiple images, if the FBI's databases had not been comprehensive enough to connect the cases across state lines, if Vincent Greer had not kept souvenirs from his crimes, if he had been just slightly more careful about covering his tracks, the case could easily have remained unsolved forever, another mystery to haunt families and frustrate investigators. But it did not remain unsolved. 20 years of silence ended with an arrest, a trial, and a conviction. Not perfect justice, perhaps. Justice can never be perfect when 20 innocent people are dead and their killer refuses to explain why. But justice nonetheless, such as the world allows. The Parker family, the Sullivan family, the Martinez family, the Yates family, and the others whose names became forever linked with Vincent Greer deserve to be remembered not as victims but as people who lived full lives before those lives were stolen. Thomas with his careful accounting work and his commute to Chicago, Jennifer with her third-grade students who loved her, Melissa with her dreams of marine biology, David with his baseball cards. All of them, all 20 people, reduced to evidence and testimony and photographs in a courtroom, but once alive, once whole, they once part of the normal American fabric of work and school and family dinners and weekend plans. Their story ends here, in a federal courtroom in Chicago, with a verdict and a sentence, and a man who will die in prison without ever explaining himself. It ends with families who must find ways to live with permanent loss, with investigators who carry the weight of cases that took decades to solve, with a community that will never quite forget what happened on Sycamore Drive that February weekend in 2005. It ends, but the silence that Vincent Greer created continues, and will continue long after he is gone. That silence is his final act of cruelty, the last way he can exert control over the people he destroyed. And so the families wait, still hoping that someday, somehow, they might learn what really happened in those final moments, that might find some measure of peace beyond the verdict and the sentence and the closed cell door. But Vincent Greer says nothing, and the silence endures.